Tara. All right, so how many of you have rented in Santa Cruz County? Okay, how many of you are currently renting in Santa Cruz County? All right, I think that's just about everybody here. Really affordable, right? Cool. So up here, there's gonna be a lot of information on these slides. I'm not gonna read it all, thank God. But see the red number there and the black number above it? These are the wages for living in Santa Cruz and the wages that people are actually earning. So that's the average hourly wage versus what you would have to earn to live here affordably, which according to Housing and Urban Development federally, that's a third of your wages at a gross level. Gross, not net. So think about people who are brewing your coffee, who are turning over beds in this hotel. Those are the folks we're thinking about when we're thinking about affordability. So Santa Cruz is one of the most expensive places. That's the zip code we're in right now. These are the local trends. Most of it's getting more expensive. Studios, one bedrooms, that's where people like me live. Maybe some people in the audience live in places like that. This stuff changes year to year, but it's stuff to keep track of. But can you imagine if you were born, say, before 1980, can you imagine paying this much relative to what you're earning? Yeah, think about it. 1.3 million. I can't think about buying a home, can you? If you have one. Congratulations. All right, so we're gonna talk about something called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation soon. There are gonna be acronyms thrown at you. I'm gonna make sure that they are explained as concisely as possible, but this is housing production. Very low income is considered 50% or less of the area median income around here. That's probably around $70,000 a year. So this is the housing that's being produced over the last 4 years or so. Look at the income categories. Look what's getting produced. It's the stuff for people who have a lot of money. That's what the market wants. That's what the market gets. Right now, we're working against the market. This is what the city of Santa Cruz, we're using as an example, this is what the city of Santa Cruz has been tasked with building over the next 8 years, between now and 2030. Look at that graph. Look at where we are. Look where we need to go. Those numbers on the far right. Biggest one is still above moderate. That's anything above 120% of AMI. So it's still the biggest target, but we still got to build a heck of a lot more of the other categories. All right, something called the housing element. That's the plan. That's how we get it done. That's what the policies look like. That's what the city, as a governmental body, is able to affect on its own. Ideally, they work with partners like MBEP because we are conveners. We bring together stakeholders such as everybody in this room, private companies, public sector, people who can help affect this problem and start working on it from all angles. But the housing element itself is a plan for affecting development. We have to build about 5 times more units than in the 5th cycle. There's a RHNA cycle every 8 years, Regional Housing Needs Allocation, since about 1980. Nobody has been hitting their targets, as you can probably tell. It's all oriented around hitting affordability targets. So if you build enough units in each income level, ideally, things start becoming more affordable. And there's a consequence. That little note down at the bottom, if you cannot demonstrate capacity to meet your RHNA numbers in your city or your jurisdiction, it could be a county, you can lose local control. This isn't a threat, this is just reality. This is what the state of California, your elected representatives have decided is what the state needs. So these are the challenges. Governmental constraints, land use controls. That's like saying you can only build up to a certain height in this part of the city. You can only build this many units on an acre. You can only build residential. You can only build commercial. Has anybody here tried to get a permit? Yeah, enough said. Infrastructure, of course. Somebody was talking to me about getting sewage service out in rural Santa Cruz County. That's very real. You can't build without wet service, without dry, electricity, all of it. Non-governmental constraints, of course, land is scarce and land is costly here. It's beautiful, so there's a reason. Construction costs, financing, interest rates, all that. And of course, environmental concerns. Building, have you heard of CEQA? California Environmental Quality Act? Yeah, most of us are, it's another enough said kind of thing, but it's limiting. So what are we doing about it? I'm not gonna rattle all these up, but the state is trying to make it easier to get around CEQA because most of us are already building with environmental concerns in mind. A lot of these laws make it easier to build more housing on less land, make it easier to get more density. So They're trying to make it easier at the state level, trying to make it easier at the local level. This is the logic. Greater density, more and cheaper housing. Allowing more housing in commercial areas means people can be closer to where they work, closer to the amenities that make life here worth living. So this is the methodology. I'm hoping this set of slides will be available to you soon. I'm going to move on, pass it along to Sibley. He's actually working on the problem. He's building stuff.
Thanks, Kip. So it really has been great having MBEP in this region as someone who's trying to work on these policy problems and stuff that it is a regional problem. You can't build all the housing in one city and try to meet the demand that's needed all over the region, right? So we need these regional collaborations. So a little over 8 years ago, I started New Way Homes as a nonprofit, and then I teamed up with Workbench, which is a design build company. I'd love to tell you guys about it afterward if you want to talk more. But I'm trying to fill the gap. There's this huge chasm between publicly subsidized affordable housing, which is great. There's just not remotely enough of it. And the current capital structures and market for building higher end expensive housing that provides a high return. That plays a role too, but there's a ton needed in between, and we're doing very little of it in California, and it's why we're falling behind every year. So I want to just give you my top line on the housing crisis, and then a little bit of hope, and then show you what challenges remain. So people talk about the housing crisis, spending a decade working overtime on this. I've come to realize there's 3 different crises we have, and a lot of the interesting political fights that happen in Santa Cruz in particular are really come down to people being more concerned about one or the other, or thinking that something we're going to do is going to help one of these and hurt the other one. These are all very real. We have a huge housing shortage. You may have seen we're 2 to 3 million units short of housing in California to have the same amount of housing per capita that the rest of the United States already has. So that's why housing's too expensive, full stop, period. We just don't have enough of it, huge scarcity. But it's also true that everywhere in the United States there's people, because of our lack of social safety net, income inequality, lack of affordable housing, everywhere, no matter how inexpensive the housing is, there's folks who can't afford safe housing. So the lack of housing results in way more homelessness, really proven, the relationship's incredibly proven, but we would have some of this anyway in our system in the United States. So we also need to address that nationally as well as in California. And as you dig into housing, you realize, wow, we have not remotely addressed the history of segregation, of racial discrimination, redlining. We've perpetuated it. California invented single-family home only zoning specifically to keep racial segregation after the Supreme Court didn't allow it to be explicit anymore. So, and we just haven't overcome it. And now, for the first time, California is really going at trying to address all these things. We're way behind, so it's going to take a long time to overcome it, but we're at least really trying. Housing supply is coming to Santa Cruz. I could only fit on this slide probably about a third of these pictures. These are currently, 4 to 7 story buildings. At least one of these is under construction right now, but the rest are all in planning, approval, permitting process. Most of these will happen this decade, and this, again, is only about a third of them. So you're going to see a lot more housing density on our corridors, mainly downtown and a couple other corridors like Ocean Street, a little bit on Water Street, a little bit on Mission Street. That's where it's happening. Maybe 3,000 units of housing are going to get built in decades in larger buildings on those corridors, aside from ADUs and other housing as well, and university housing. So that's one thing. Permanent supportive housing, that's just the homelessness side, is also coming to Santa Cruz. I led the permitting, development, design to get this building permitted. Housing Matters, this is on the Housing Matters campus. This is Highway 1, Highway 9, the homeless services that are there. Inside that campus, a lot bigger than people realize if you haven't been there. There's going to be a new 5-story building that's all permanent supportive housing, 121 units. Construction's breaking ground this summer. Really exciting. And that's not that's the biggest permanent supportive housing project in the history of Santa Cruz County. But there's others. The housing that's under construction at the Red Church right now downtown, a part of that is permanent supportive housing. So it's a mixed income project, part of that. Over near Capitola, there's 3 others in the county that got state funding to do supportive housing. And we've even as you go to Costco, look, it's still orange in here, but now this Victorian is blue, and that's 7 units of permanent supportive housing we're just finishing up. So there's a smattering of this with a lot of services. This is for the most vulnerable people you see who are really suffering on the street, mental illness, etc. That's the housing with services that's needed. It's going to make a difference here. And then lastly, for the first time, planning is catching up with those racial segregation issues. So for the first time, those housing elements that Greg mentioned, the state has mandated every jurisdiction in California has to have a plan for affirmatively furthering fair housing. That's one way. There's other state bills doing other things, but part of the point is we can't just only add apartment buildings. Now think statewide and Los Angeles and all the places. We can't just build density in the lower income neighborhoods. Right? We also got to build it where there's jobs, where there's commercial activity, where there's good schools, where the demand is, and affordable housing at different levels in that. So, I'm trying to do one of the first apartment buildings in the middle of the Upper West Side of Santa Cruz. That's an example of this. So, we're trying. There's real work to try to mix income levels better at a neighborhood to neighborhood level in an appropriate way in the state. So that's the hope. And I just put this up here to bend your mind with text way too small to read. This is just a list of the housing bills introduced this year in the state legislature. Every year is like this. Now, 80% of these won't pass, but this is a #1 topic the state legislature works on. Some of these will pass, and every year we're passing big ones. So we're overcoming 30 years of terrible policy in the last 5 years, and we're quite a ways there. Okay, last slide. How are we really doing with, I'm interested in not just building a little more housing, but solving the problem in California. How are we doing? These are the big barriers categories from my point of view. Okay, approval risk, I think we're 90% there. So it used to be, you can meet some grizzled, really cynical developers who've been at it for 40 years in Santa Cruz because you were taking an enormous risk proposing anything, and for no reason at all, the city could just, after you spent $1 million on planning and permits, could say, no, you can't do it. That's not true anymore. We only bring forward projects that cities are obligated to approve. So this is through state laws. In my view, it's 90% solved. Legalizing housing, we just made most housing illegal to build in most places. Okay, we shouldn't be sprawling anymore. We shouldn't be building our green belt or out in our farmland, but we should have density. We should allow density, right? And we've gotten ADUs are legal, more density is legal. So we're halfway there, and the state legislature is going to get the rest of the way there with all these housing bills and everything. These are the ones that we are not really working on enough yet. The cost is enormous. People are shocked when they come and see enough, like, I want to build an apartment building with 0 profit, still can't make it work most of the time, right? So this is tough, but we are doing a little bit. There's the modular construction, we're changing some building codes, there's things we need to do more. And the workforce, we do not even have the construction industry of the size to build housing even close to the rate we need to build it to solve this problem in 20 years. Like we lost 1/3 of our construction industry in the last Great Recession and never got it back. So we've got to work on workforce development here. I'll leave it there. That's the big picture. But we are going to make a lot of progress this decade. I think you'll see a lot of change in Santa Cruz.